Hey, so on today's news breakdown, U.S. ambassador spends millions to get Israel. The attorney general has decided to side with murderers against their victims here in Israel, and finally, only in Israel. Well, maybe also in the United States. The head of our political opposition has taken the witness stand against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That and much more on my breakdown of the news. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome to another Carolyn Breaks Down the News, or whatever we're calling this new show. I wanted to just give you a few highlights of what's happening today in Israel. I'm taping on Monday, the 12th of June, 2022. And so the first headline that I chose today was that the United States is authorized $1 million to get Israel. And our friend over at the Washington Free Beacon, Adam Credo, reported over the weekend, I think, that newly released Freedom of Information Act documents from the U.S. Embassy showed that Ambassador Tom Nides, who's now the outgoing U.S. ambassador to Israel, in January of 2022, signed an authorization for the United States to spend up to nearly $1 million in grants to NGOs. I'm not sure if each grant was for $987,000 or was supposed to be total of $987,000. Probably the former, though, to NGOs that were going to seek out dirt on Israel to try to criminalize the government of Israel. Here's the exact wording. $1 million to grants to groups that would be empowering activist groups critical of Israel to pursue false claims that the Jewish state is systematically abusing Palestinians and seizing their land. That's a quote from the Washington Free Beacon article. So this is a pretty amazing finding. It means that the State Department and the U.S. Embassy here in Jerusalem decided that what they really needed to do was with U.S. taxpayer dollars was to try to criminalize the Jewish state. And this isn't that surprising because, of course, the United States is also actively funding terrorist organizations engaged in war against Israel. Our friend Tony Bedron, who's been on the Carolyn Glick show a few times, wrote an article last week at Tablet Online magazine where he described U.S. funding for the Lebanese armed forces, which are controlled by Hezbollah, and the Lebanese intelligence services, which are also controlled by Hezbollah. Not only does the United States fund weapons to these Hezbollah-controlled organizations, but now they're trying to skirt U.S. law to directly pay the salaries of 100,000 Lebanese soldiers and officers, all controlled by Hezbollah, and also the salaries of their intelligence services that are giving all of the information that they gain through their U.S.-trained operatives to Hezbollah. So we're talking about not only, the Lebanese banking system has collapsed, so what is the United States doing? They're paying them in cash. Now, you're not allowed to do that under U.S. law because they're working in cahoots and under the control of a terrorist organization. So the United States is funneling the actual cash to the UN Development Program, the UNDP, and the UNDP is handing out cash payments to Lebanese soldiers and officers and to Lebanese intelligence officers. And all of these organizations and individuals are working and indeed living at the pleasure of Hezbollah and its Iranian Revolutionary Guard controllers. So this is a pretty amazing thing. So the United States is directly funding the Lebanese armed forces. Again, I just feel like repeating myself because it's stunning. 100,000 Lebanese soldiers and officers. And this has, by the way, been American policy since Condoleezza Rice was Secretary of State. It's just been massively escalated during Obama's tenure. Trump didn't stop it because he had these people in the State Department continuing to push this policy during his tenure in office. And Mike Pompeo, for whatever reason, decided not to stop it. And now under the Biden administration, they're expanding their largesse to these Hezbollah-controlled Lebanese entities. And one of the one of the interesting things that Tony Badran brought in his report of U.S. funding of these terrorist groups is that the United States started funding Lebanese, I think, intelligence in 2009. And in 2009, almost directly after the United States had started funding and training Lebanese intelligence operatives, amazingly, they exposed an Israeli spying network in Lebanon. Recently, when the United States upped its support for the Lebanese intelligence service, it's called the ISF, they said that they found 3 networks of Israeli spies that they have just exposed. So U.S. funding for these intelligence services is going to wage war against Israel and undermine Israel's ability to gather intelligence and to fight the Iranian-controlled terrorist organization Hezbollah, which controls Lebanon. And this isn't surprising, again, because the Lebanese armed forces at the United States, U.S. taxpayers, are paying in cash officers and enlisted men, and Lebanese intelligence officers that U.S. taxpayers are also paying salaries to in cash through the UN. These organizations are controlled by Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is the Lebanese branch of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. This is all known to everybody, and everybody is pretending that they don't understand what's happening and that they don't understand reality and that these are really going to build up, support for stability and security for the Lebanese people. Of course, this is all a lie. What it does is it builds up the stability and security of Iran's control of Lebanon through Hezbollah. And why does the United States want that? Well, we'll get to that in a second, or maybe we won't because there's no rational answer, but we'll give some surmises. And then they're also giving, of course, $1 billion a year, more or less, to the Palestinians. And the Palestinians have no leadership that is not terrorist. None. Not the Palestinian Authority that's dominated by the Fatah terrorist organization that spends a very large chunk of their annual budget paying salaries to terrorists that are jailed in Israeli prisons for terrorist offenses they already committed, or the pensions that their families received if they're terrorists who were killed by Israeli counter-terrorist operations. The United States is underwriting that by giving $1 billion to the Palestinian Authority. And this, by the way, is against American law. In 2017, the U.S. passed the Taylor Force Act, right, that made it illegal for the United States to continue funding the Palestinian Authority so long as it's sponsoring terrorism. So the United States gives it to NGOs that sponsor terrorism or operate at the largesse of the Palestinian Authority. They give it to the UN, which also is sort of an auxiliary force to Palestinian terrorist organizations, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and Fatah in Judea and Samaria. So the United States' entire policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians is paying for terrorist organizations to continue to operate. So you have, let's see, you have Lebanon, you have the Palestinian Authority, and then you have Iran. So I think last week in my conversation with Dave Wormser, we were talking about the fact that, the U.S. has sent Brett McGurk to Oman to have indirect negotiations with the Iranians through the Omanis, and the UN's envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, has been meeting in New York with the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations and having negotiations with him. And so far, the first interim arrangement that they reached was that the United States was going to enable the unfreezing of around $10 billion in frozen Iranian accounts being held by Iraq on the one hand, about $3 billion, and $7 billion being held by South Korea for payments for oil and gas to Iran that were frozen after the Trump administration slapped the sanctions on Iran's exports of energy in 2019. So they're unfreezing. $2.7 billion have already been unfrozen by the Iraqis, and the money is just pouring into Iran now, thanks to the Biden administration. So the United States is funding a terrorist regime in Iran. It's funding a terrorist regime in Lebanon. It's funding 2 terrorist regimes in the Palestinian-controlled areas and the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria and the Hamas terrorist authority in Gaza. looks like there's a pattern here, but I can't quite figure out what it is. Oh, plus the $1 million grants that the U.S. Ambassador Tom Nides authorized for fishing expeditions against Israel by political organizations called NGOs. So that's just 4 of the latest things that, we've been discussing over the past week. And I'm detecting a pattern, but I'll just add a little wrinkle to that too, which is that, in the U.S., the Biden White House released on the eve of Shavuot, when we were all off, praying all night or whatever it was we were doing, celebrating the holiday, their strategy for fighting anti-Semitism. And one of the implementing organizations is one of the most powerful anti-Semitic organizations in the United States, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. And Deborah Lipstadt, who is the presidential or the State Department envoy for combating anti-Semitism, she gave this interview to the Jerusalem Post the other day where she was like, yeah, well, we're really going to hold them to a high standard. And it was the White House outreach office that asked me to bring in CARE as an implementing organization. And, we're not going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Of course, you just did by saying that an organization that has been instrumental both in supporting Hamas, a genocidally anti-Semitic organization that's also a terrorist group prescribed by the U.S. State Department. But CARE has been active in promoting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns against American Jews on college campuses and in boardrooms and other places throughout the United States. That's CARE is an unindicted co-conspirator in the terror funding mega trial against the Holy Land Foundation and Trust from 2007 during the Bush years after 9/11. And, it's never gotten out from under that suspicion because more and more stories, every time that the United States has tried to kosher CARE, CARE's representatives have come out with yet another anti-Semitic diatribe, whether in their branch offices in places like Minnesota or Los Angeles or Chicago or their national offices. So, they have these incredibly viciously anti-Semitic and anti-Israel Nakba Day demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and in other places around the United States. We saw them most recently just last month. And yet here it is, the Biden administration has decided that their anti-Semitism strategy to protect the Jews of the United States is going to be implemented, among others, by the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE. So, I guess it makes sense, right? When you put it together with funding Iranian terrorists, when funding Lebanese terrorists, funding Palestinian terrorists, and paying money to organizations that are going to go out and actively seek to criminalize the Jewish state and its counterterror operations. I mean, and, we could go on. We could talk about what Hadi Amar is doing here. He's a terror supporter who Biden appointed to be a special envoy for the Palestinians because he couldn't give him a consulate without Israel's permission in Jerusalem. So, he's here again this week and supporting, Palestinian terrorists. So that's just what the American policy is. And now, why is it? We had Dave Wormser on the show last week, and we were talking about it, and he said, look, you have to understand, this is a government, this is an administration that's guided by their progressive ideology. And their progressive ideology, we must say, it's anti-American. It thinks that the United States was born in the original sin of slavery, white supremacism, et cetera, and they also hate the Jewish state, and they don't like the idea of nation states in general. So, so much of the U.S. government policy today is dictated by ideology, not by U.S. interests. In fact, the ideology itself is antithetical to U.S. interests, whether it's, just erasing the border with Mexico and letting everybody in without any vetting, or going after America's top allies in the Middle East. And one interesting story, I think, that talks to the collapse of rationality in U.S. national security policy is, the Saudi Arabians, right? Saudis made some suggestions, very clear ones, that they wanted to normalize their relations with Israel publicly. They were already pretty normal behind the scenes, and they said that they were willing to do that because, there's a huge economic dividend for them as well. They can reinstate the pipeline from the Gulf through Israel to Europe for the transfer of gas, basically obviate the Straits of Hormuz as a strategic waterway, because they would be able to transfer their gas and oil just across the land from the Arabian Peninsula through Iraq, Jordan, into Israel, and out through either Haifa Bay or the port of Ashdod to Europe. So, that's something that they would want to do. It would be worth billions and billions and billions of dollars to them to do that. And again, it would massively weaken Iran from a strategic perspective. But America wants to be friends with Iran. It doesn't want to be friends with Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis said, we want peaceful nuclear energy. It's probably bad news, but it's not like America is their only option for getting it, right? So they're saying to the United States, look, we prefer to go with you, but if we don't go with you, there are other bidders. For years, there was talk that the Pakistani nuclear program was funded by the Saudi Arabians, and basically from Pakistan, they can get whatever they want nuclear-wise. So what the Americans' refusal to help the Saudi Arabians with this meant was essentially that Saudi Arabia would just do it their own way, which apparently is what they're planning on doing, and also normalizing the relations not with Israel but with Iran. So that's just a little side thing. And now I just want to move from America's incredible hostility towards Israel to what's happening here in Israel itself. Last week we were talking about the violence that's now really come to characterize the left's insurrection against Israel. And we're seeing this in so many different ways. So on Sunday night, Channel 14 had this pretty amazing revelation, which were the text of this secret WhatsApp group of the leaders of the so-called pro-democracy demonstrations that involve assaulting and browbeating and beating cabinet ministers and supporters, and taking over the highway in Tel Aviv and blocking highways, and basically just harassing people and saying that Israelis don't have any right to democracy because we elected the wrong people. So anyway, so they had this internal chat group, and you had Ehud Olmert, our former failed prime minister, who's also next Khan. Ehud Barak, our former failed prime minister, is also a good friend of Jeffrey Epstein. And you should read my expose on Ehud Barak from a week and a half ago on his pretty difficult position vis-a-vis the United States and some serious damage that he's wreaked on Israel's cyber technology industry for the benefit of the Democrats. At any rate, so Ehud Barak is on this chat, along with Ehud Olmert. Ehud Barak is a former IDF chief of staff, and two other IDF former chiefs of staff, Don Chalutz, who's a failed chief of staff who failed to adequately lead IDF forces in the Second Lebanon War in 2006. Moshe Ya'alon, the failed defense minister, who left the Likud in a huff because Netanyahu fired him from the defense ministry. Anyway, so the three, Barak, Olmert, Chalutz, Moshe Ya'alon, Shikma Bresler, we've talked about for the past couple of weeks. She's sort of the appassionara of the radical left, calling for everybody to go to the barricades, man the barricades against this terrible government, who was paid for by Ehud Barak and his Black Flags NGO or whatever, and some other, rich people. They're all on this chat group together, and they're all in a panic because they can't get people to show up for their demonstrations. Now, it's true that the media covers for them. There are apparently 8,000 people out on Saturday night, and the news coverage was that there were 80,000. One said 130,000 people at this demonstration, when there were actually 8,000 people there, and they were saying they wish that they could get to 35,000 that would come to their demonstrations. And they said that people aren't so upset about judicial reform anymore, and they need to figure out something else to get people involved in. And so they said that they need more violence. They needed to be a civil insurrection. They have to start calling for a civil insurrection. And days after they had this chat on Saturday night, Ehud Barak got up on TV and called for a civil insurrection. So they're sort of flailing. They don't quite know how to continue on. And it seems that Netanyahu's policy of attriting them through endless conversations at the president's house about judicial reform may work out to have been an okay policy. And then, so they're kind of flailing, although they still benefit from the complete protection of the Attorney General. And I'll just give you one example. Last Thursday, I wrote about it in JNS in my article that came out last Friday. But on Thursday night, one of the many, many assaults against cabinet ministers and members of the coalition, there was an attempted assault against Nir Barkat as he was going to a meeting, I think at the Federation, but I'm not sure, in Boston. And he was in an office building, and this crowd of Israelis who had flown into Boston to heckle him and to harangue him and to intimidate him and assault him. So they're all screaming at him in the hallway of this office building, and then one of the rioters manages to get past his security detail and gets close to him, and then his bodyguards wrestled him to the floor. It's all, they all have their cell phones out and they're all photographing it. So you get it from a bunch of different angles, and you finally get the real angle that shows that he's lunging at Nir Barkat. This is the fourth assault or attempted physical assault against Nir Barkat in the past several months. So anyway, Sunday morning, they're back, or Monday morning, they're back outside of his house in Jerusalem with their whistles and their megaphones and their drums and screaming at him. And nothing ever happens. As I said last week, 6,000 people were arrested, 900 people were indicted in 2005 on charges of whatever for engaging in civil disobedience in the months ahead of the expulsion of all the Jews from Gaza and northern Samaria and Ariel Sharon's disengagement plan that transferred control over Gaza to Hamas. And here, with all of the highway blockages almost on a weekly basis at a minimum, and all of these illegal acts of violence that are taking place all over the country and outside of the country by these leftist anarchists that are paid for by Barak and Olmert and all the rest of them through, acting probably as agents for God only knows who. So only less than 100 people have been arrested and nobody's been indicted. So no law is being enforced against these people. But this guy comes up to these rioters outside of Nir Barkat's house, and he throws an egg at them. And guess what? He got arrested. So nobody gets arrested on the left. This guy comes, throws an egg at them. Probably deserved to get arrested for that. I think so. But nobody else is getting arrested. None of the leftists are getting arrested. So the law enforcement is crazy. And then over the weekend, this Druze woman named Sarah Hussein, she was murdered by her brothers. And Sarah was the 101st, I think, murder victim among the Arab Druze sector of Israeli society. And she was murdered for, it was an honor killing. And her honor crime was that she had come out 3 years before as a lesbian. And her brothers at that point told her that they were going to kill her if she didn't abandon that idea that she's a lesbian. And they were briefly arrested and brought before the judge. And, she told the judge that they were trying to murder her. And the judge let her out, let them out of jail and said, well, he hopes they can find a way to make peace in their family. And their way of making peace in their family was killing her 3 years later. And so that's what happened. And her killing, like I said, I think it was the 100th or 101st killing in the non-Jewish sector of Israel, the Arab, the Druze, in what's called honor killings or in gangland shootings among Arabs in Israel. And the government said, look, we need to fight this. And the way to fight this is to have the Shin Bet, the intelligence services, get involved in the fight against this Arab wave of crime. And the truth is that the line dividing this kind of crime from terrorism is very, very thin. And Gali Baharav Miara, who has only remained Attorney General with the Netanyahu administration, even though she was appointed by Netanyahu's nemesis, Gideon Sa'ar, when he was Justice Minister in the Bennett-Lapid government, is in order to throw, to gum up the works and to block the government from actually getting anything done. So that, as in fulfillment of her duties as she sees them, she said she didn't think it was a good idea. She wasn't going to allow the Shin Bet to get involved with fighting crime in the Arab sector. And in Yediot Achronot on Monday morning, they had this column that was written by an Arab Israeli who has been threatened with death for being a reporter and reporting about the dimensions of crime in the Arab sector. And he said that, he's certain that he's going to be dead soon and that his family won't leave his side because they assume that he has a death sentence hanging over him. And he expects to be killed because his life has been threatened for doing his work. And, and now Gali Baharav Miara said, yeah, you're probably going to die. We don't care. We're not going to do anything because fighting the government, the Netanyahu government, blocking it from doing its job is much more important than protecting the lives of Israeli citizens. So yeah, you're not going to be protected because I have to protect my regime of non-elected government lawyers and justices who select themselves, and any compromise and any move on my part to allow the government to actually exert its lawful authority would be counterproductive to my efforts to maintain the dictatorship of the unelected here in Israel. So, in the name of democracy, you're probably right. You're probably going to get killed. Sorry about that. So that's what's happening here. And believe it or not, under the circumstances, people don't seem to want to show up to their demonstrations anymore on Saturday night, or certainly not enough of them. And finally, and I just want to end with this because I really do think that, this is something that, I don't know, should we pride ourselves for? I'm not sure. But here in Israel on Monday was a big show of the week. Opposition leader Yair Lapid took the witness stand in Netanyahu's criminal trial. I talked about his trial, I think 3 weeks ago with my friend Moshe Kovarsky. You should check out that episode if you haven't seen it yet. So just in a nutshell, the prosecution's case started falling apart as soon as the trial opened because every single prosecution witness in the 3 counts that Netanyahu was indicted on have all gone on the stand as prosecution witnesses, and they've all exited the courtroom at the end of their testimony, having actually destroyed the prosecution's case. I think there was one witness who didn't break under questioning, but her credibility was so undermined both by her own testimony and that of people who are involved in the same allegations that she's made against the prime minister that it didn't really matter at the end of the day. So this week, the opposition head, Yair Lapid, is on the witness stand for what they view as was supposed to be the most ironclad of the allegations against Netanyahu, that he received he was doing favors for movie producer and businessman Arnon Milchan, because Arnon Milchan gave him a lot of cigars and a lot of champagne. And as Moishik was explaining when he was here on the show, we got almost no cigars or champagne. Somebody who did get a lot more cigars from Milchan was actually Yair Lapid, who is a former employee of the businessman. At any rate, back in 2013, Yair Lapid was finance minister in Netanyahu's government, and Milchan wanted to see whether it would be possible for the government to change the law that now says that Israelis who have lived abroad for a certain number of years and new olim coming to Israel have an exemption from paying income tax in Israel for 10 years. We wanted to extend it for 20. Personally, I think that there are reasons to do that. At any rate, Netanyahu is accused of using his influence as prime minister to try to advance Milchan's request, and that he did this because Milchan gave him so much pink champagne and cigars. So work at that, Yair Lapid gets up on the stand and he says, no, actually, Netanyahu never really weighed in on that. I mean, he just said, it might not be a bad idea, but it was never really, he never requested it and he never told me to do anything specific on this. And it didn't go anywhere. And the truth is that, as we know, Yair Lapid did a lot and worked really hard to try to give Milchan what he wanted, because Milchan asked him to do it, not because he asked Netanyahu to do it, and certainly not because Netanyahu asked Yair Lapid to do it. At any rate, it's always nice to see the head of opposition take the witness stand in a concocted criminal trial against the prime minister on charges that fell apart 3 years ago. But whatever, that's where we are in Israel today. And my guest on the Carolyn Glick Show this week is former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. And among other things, I'll be talking to him about what's happening on the other side of the pond with the latest indictment of Donald Trump. And I'm sure that there, too, you're going to see the parallels between the legal fraternity here's their obsessive-compulsive pursuit of Netanyahu on the one hand, and what's happening with the Department of Justice and the Biden White House and their pursuit of former president and leading Republican contender for the Republican presidential nomination, Donald Trump, on the other hand. So we're going to be looking at that with David Friedman, among many other things, but those are the major stories that I've been looking at so far over the past several days, and I just wanted to share my intuition about them with you. And we'll see you later. We'll see you next week for my news breakdown, and we'll see you later this week for my conversation with David Friedman.